Welcome to Resourced and Resourceful Leadership, a podcast for people who care about the world and their impact in it. I'm Dr. Christine Pettit. Thank you for joining me today. Today's episode is going to start off with some reflection about the last episode, episode 30, Calling in Community. And then I'm going to connect that to some of the headlines of today or of recent weeks, and in some cases months and years. I want to round out a little bit more some of the things that I didn't say in episode 30 that were swirling around in my brain. I did want to also share that the last episode was my most vulnerable to date, and I had said that about episode 29, so I think I'm doing something right. But ironically, sharing how I am thinking about things, and especially in naming cancel culture and in just contemplating what accountability is, and just talking about that topic, that felt more scary to me than the previous episode where I was literally talking to myself. And that was a very vulnerable episode as well, talking to the part of myself that is afraid of being left behind or thrown away. And I think why this last episode was vulnerable is because it touched on that part. And it wasn't just like sharing my perspective vulnerably, but talking about things that in some ways have been taboo to talk about or question in some of the like organizing spaces that I've been part of. And that has just something that I'm working on moving through, and just like one, recognizing my thoughts can change and evolve over time. They don't have to be stated perfectly in the moment. I can think through and like grapple with things, and it doesn't just have to be like the quote unquote party line or like what's socially acceptable to say or acceptable in a certain group. So I'm just doing what I set out to do with this podcast, really, is to explore honing my own voice and using it as a place to process what I've been learning and thinking about and experiencing over the years, and to make sense of all of that and to do it out loud, because as I've said before, right now doing it out loud is easier for me than writing. But I hope that one, with the transcripts of all of this, it can help me move into have something to build off of for writing, but also getting more clear on my thoughts. I appreciate you being part of this journey with me. I will say I got a text from a friend and listener about last week's episode, and he said the episode on accountability really spoke to me on all kinds of levels. As someone that has been a perpetrator of handling some of these things poorly and having been disturbed by the harm caused by cancel culture, and currently thinking about how to have difficult conversations, I found your framing and suggestions so helpful. Thank you. So I just want to say thank you for sharing that with me. And I always appreciate hearing whether it's this was helpful, or I welcome hearing other perspectives as well. But that text meant a lot to me because I was feeling really vulnerable about the episode. So I'm glad to know that it was helpful to at least one person beyond myself as well. That also reminds me, I got a text from someone else about my previous episode. I'm not sharing names right now because I didn't ask for permission, but in the one about sharing about the part of myself that was afraid to be left behind or thrown away. My friend wrote, "Your most recent podcast, Christine, you are courageous and model what self-leadership looks like. Thank you for modeling for your listeners how it looks to tend to our inner landscape. You are amazing, so inspired." So just sending love to back out to my friends and also to anyone who's listening and just part of this experience, whether you're communicating back with me or not. Of course, I always welcome that, but I appreciate hearing that folks are listening and appreciate knowing how you're thinking about things as well. As I was preparing to record this podcast, I read Gordon Edgar's most recent Patreon post about grief at 3.5 years. I've talked about Gordon before because we've connected really since the death of his wife, who was dear to me, Lori Jones Neighbors. And he wrote in his latest Patreon, "I wrote myself out of some of my early grief. My writing connected me with some people I needed to connect with, even if I didn't know them yet. As I have explained before, I write to figure things out for myself. I post because being public is an internal control to make sure I am being honest." I really appreciate that. So he was writing, this post is grief at 3.5 years. And Lori's birthday is coming up on April 8th. She would have been 60. Lori is actually somebody that I talked to about cancel culture. I had posted a meme and something that I said on social media, and she asked me about it when we checked in. It was during the pandemic, and it was like this someone with a confused face. It's someone who was on Selling Sunset, but just like this face that she was making was memeified. And so she was looking confused, and what I wrote was like me when I see people who promote transformative justice or restorative justice. So I think I said transformative justice, participating in cancel campaigns. And Lori asked me about that, and she was like, "What is this that you're talking about? Is this a thing?" And so I shared with her my perspective on it and how I was seeing things. And she was like, "Wow, that's so wild." Like in kind of the punk movement and spaces that she had been part of. I don't know if she like considers herself part of the punk movement actually, but like spaces around that. She was like, I felt we would bend over backwards to try to keep people in community and to resolve those things, to have accountability, but just the complete opposite direction of cancel culture. And so it was just surprising to her. So I remember talking to her about that early on as I was starting to articulate what I was seeing. And then I haven't really said much publicly about my observation. So it's, again, because it's felt like scary and risky to, and okay, also just naming I am a white woman navigating these spaces, and so how that will be read as well. So I'm aware of that. But I also want to be in dialogue with folks and name what's true, and also not feel like what's authentic for me, I guess. Not feel like I'm holding back just to perform in a certain way, really. And that kind of leads me into my next topic, which is that part of what was unsaid in my last podcast was reflecting on the headlines that came out, the stories that have come out related to Cesar Chavez and So now I guess this is my content warning for folks who are listening. I am going to talk about sexual assault and sexual abuse of minors, not in any sort of detail, but just in the context of our headlines, and not just because of Cesar Chavez, because of the Epstein files, because of our president, because of the culture that we live in. But I just want to name that in case you're like, this is not what I want to be listening to right now. So I have been thinking about accountability, and I guess I wanted to say some of the things that were unnamed were just like, yeah, the world that we're swirling in related to sexual assault and sexual violence. And I don't want this to be a show that's dictated by the headlines. I don't ever want to feel like I need to talk about something and do so in a performative way. But when I read today what Gordon wrote about why he writes to figure things out for himself and posting publicly as an internal control, I thought what I haven't been talking about is how this news related to Cesar Chavez is impacting me, and how I'm starting to, and how I've been thinking about it, and even the conversations that I've been having with friends. And I will say, I'm going to talk about some of the conversations I've had with friends, again, without saying their name, because I didn't ask for permission to share their particular ideas. But in doing so, I'm not trying to take these ideas as my own. So I will name where they came up in conversation as well. So the first, in episode 29, that was right when, I think around that time was right when the news broke, when the story of Cesar Chavez's sexual abuse of minors, Anna Murguia and Deborah Rojas, and potentially others, as well as his sexual assault of Dolores Huerta. That's when all that came public. And so I was just going to say a little kind of PS to folks who are feeling tender. I felt tender about it. I read, I think, Dolores Huerta's statement, or I read an article with her, and I remember I just shed one single tear, and then I felt like I needed to move on with my day. And so I did. As I'm talking about it right now, I'm getting a little teary-eyed. And I think because it's Dolores Huerta, because she's a big name, a respected leader, her story is what first captured my attention. And just thinking about her enduring that and carrying that secret, and the impact on the children that she had as a result, and carrying all that to protect the face of a movement, to really to protect the movement, but because Cesar Chavez was the face of the movement, is protecting him and the cause that she believed in. And then also just thinking about, she lent her name and her experience because she heard about the abuse of these children, Anna and Deborah. And I don't want them to be forgotten in this as well. I just want to name that because they don't have the same stature as Dolores, the same standing and regard. And they were children too when it happened, in an incredibly vulnerable position with someone that they likely and their families looked up to and trusted. And so some of the conversations that I've been having with people, one of my friends was really impacted and crying most of the day. And she and I both have strong connections to the labor movement. So I think there's a feeling of sadness and loss there, as well as, of course, the abuse, the sexual violence, and experiencing those things that were tender. And I am not going to speak for her, but I imagine too, having met and walked picket lines with Dolores Huerta, feeling some connection to her as well. So just I want to name the grief and the sadness, whether it's from the perspective of being a survivor of sexual abuse and sexual assault, whether it's of being someone who cares about these movements, whether it was someone who saw themselves in the stories of the children of Dolores, or even in Cesar, to have a hero, like someone in the Latino community to look up for, someone who look up to, someone who schools are named after, someone who streets are named after, holidays are named after, to be able to have someone as a point of cultural pride to learn these terrible things. It's heartbreaking. So just holding that grief for a moment. I also talked with a friend, a Latina, who's, all this is sad. And I never liked Cesar, or I was not never liked, but I was always critical of him because of his stance on undocumented immigrants and because of the sexism in the United Farm Workers movement. And so kind of she had that perspective too of, this is someone I hadn't put too far on a pedestal, so it's not as devastating. Of course it's devastating for all sorts of reasons, but not as devastating. And she told me, I didn't really know, it's not hard to find, I didn't know about his stance on illegal immigration. That's what he called it, the illegals campaign in the 70s, but I'll say undocumented workers. But he believed that having undocumented workers destroyed the bargaining power of unionized farm workers. And of course, those who own farmers would use any source of labor they could to break strikes and to bypass their labor standards. Cesar Chavez really took a stance against undocumented immigrants and unauthorized immigration in the 1970s. Not everyone in the movement agreed with that. Some people thought it was very short-sighted. And despite him being opposed to illegal immigration, he supported the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, which helped to bring legal status to millions of people. So it was a, complex kind of relationship and thinking about things. But that was one of the stance my friends was like, yeah, I've always been skeptical of him. And then also she told me that the solidarity clap, or the unity clap, where you start out clapping slow and then get faster and stronger, that had been used to quiet out the voices of people who shared kind of differing perspectives or critical views. And in particular, she said it was used on women. So I was looking that up more because both of those things I hadn't really heard about. What I had heard about was the game, and this was really internal to the top leadership and the folks who lived in La Paz So not throughout the organization, but in the leadership. This game, it was modeled off of this cult called Synanon. It was like let's see. So the game was a controversial, mandatory, and intense psychological encounter group session introduced to the United Farm Workers by Cesar Chavez in the 1970s, and it was adopted from the drug rehab program Synanon. The idea behind it was that participants would sit around and berate one another, share intimate details, and have this kind of like brutal, high energy, emotional environment. And so they said it was, those who like supported it said it was supposed to build intimacy and unity, but for those who experienced it and were more critical of it, it was manipulative, and it was like a cult-like tool used to enforce discipline and weed out dissent within the UFW leadership and staff. And so I had heard about that and was skeptical of it. So I had heard about that, and I definitely was put off by that. And just thinking about organizing tactics that I am familiar with, some of them do really lean on manipulation, and that wasn't my experience as a union organizer. So I will say this is all like also very uncomfortable to talk to, because unions as an organization, or to speak to, because unions as an organization are vilified in our country overall. There's been attacks on unions and the corruption and this and that. And I will just say, anything that you see in a union organization that you don't like can happen to more extremes, or just in the same way or more in any organization in society, in churches, in government, in all sorts of organizations. And this is where I was talking to my friend who's done labor organizing work as well. And we talked about some of the manipulative tactics, and she's, yeah, manipulation for good. And I was like, we have to be careful what we define as good and bad. And I said the Nazis thought what they were doing was good. And that might seem extreme, but it is true. This is a little bit of a tangent, but there have been studies on the Milgram experiment, for those who want to go back to Psych 101, or even maybe you learned this in high school, I don't know. But the experiment where people think they're giving electric shocks to participants, even if they're like yelping and saying, I'm gonna die and whatever, and they show concern, but the experimenter says, oh, you must continue. And so that research has long been used to say that people go along with authority figures, and that folks in Nazi Germany, for example, were just going along with authority, and so we shouldn't blindly obey authority, which all of that is important to keep in mind. But when they did further investigation of like going back and analyzing the Milgram experience, there was a Radio Lab episode on this that I started playing for my sociology courses. What they found was that people weren't following necessarily because they thought they had to obey authority. In fact, when they were told they didn't have any choice to continue, that's where more people did say, yeah, actually, I do have a choice. But when they were given a good reason, a quote unquote good reason for it to experiment, like this is very important for science, they might be uncomfortable, but this is for the greater good, we need to do this. Those were the things that kept people continuing on with the experiment. And so what I've taken from that is just to be really careful, like what we do in the name of good, and to be skeptical of that. Like the means in which we do things, I believe, are still important to consider. And even the best intentions can lead to, even like the vision that we have, if we go about it in a way that is repressive or violent or whatever, we can end up replicating the same systems of oppression that we're trying to change, or the same horrors that we're trying to change. And so we just need to be really careful what we're doing in the name of quote unquote good. I'm not a relativist. I do believe there are things that are good and bad and whatnot. So it's not like everything's a gray area, but I do think we need to be careful about the tactics that we use. And getting back to the example that we're talking about with Cesar Chavez, not protecting somebody at all odds for the cost of the movement, for the cost of some social good. Yeah, we have to do better than that, I believe. So definitely revisiting or thinking about this has made me revisit some unhealthy organizing environments that I've been part of. And the other conversation that I think that has been coming up with my friends is about putting one person on a pedestal or not doing that, and how as movements, there's so many people. I really like the move to think about this more broadly, the farm workers movement, farm workers day, versus just replacing it with Dolores Huerta Day or any one person, because I think that's where we get in trouble, is when we like elevate one person to a status where they're like untouchable, and where if something comes out about them, one, it's like incredibly devastating, or two, people just deny. Which brings me to Trump. Speaking of one person that some people really put up on a pedestal, and I think knowing like he's totally imperfect, and a lot of people totally think he is a creep, but a lot of people who support him, they do it for other reasons. But I do think there's some, I can't talk about putting one leader up on a pedestal without talking about what's happening in our country around Trump and the just incredible destruction that is happening as a result. So I want to talk more about that, but first, just getting to the idea of the breadth of movements, all the people behind them, the people who have typically done the work that has been unrecognized. I remember the work of women is often unrecognized in movements, or only people with certain qualities get lifted up because they're seen as worthy of being the face of the movement or above reproach. It's like a protective thing. And I think it was the anti-war movement, maybe it was civil rights. I remember reading about how the organizing of women, and in particular lesbians, was not acknowledged. And so I just think, we're so much stronger. This is like cliche, but we're stronger together. We're stronger when we recognize the breadth of it. I don't think we need, as a society, the same like one person that we look up to for these things. And so I hope from all of this that there can be a recognition of the breadth of movements versus one singular leader. I also hope that as a result of this, there is more awareness about sexual abuse at the hands of those that we trust, that it is usually people who are close to and regarded within families that are the perpetrators of sexual abuse of children. And I hope that we can, as a society, move toward that accountability that I talked about and defined in the last episode with the help of Confluence Rising, that we can move toward more societal accountability around how we protect children, how we protect people who are potential victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, and more accountability to not protect, not insulate those who are perpetrating these things. And that does bring me back to the headlines of the day. Yeah, I don't think we should be lifting up Cesar Chavez. I do think things should change. But I just have this image in my head of someone unscrewing like the bust of Cesar Chavez from like a monument. And I think about the Confederate monuments that are still up. I think about schools that are named after, for example, Thomas Jefferson, who has this link to and had at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, who was enslaved. And just thinking about this, like there's this power dynamic around consent there, and so many examples. Literally, our president got elected and people knew who he was. He talked about groping women in much more crass terms. He's settled lawsuits related to perpetrating sexual violence. He's sexualized his own daughter. And yet that continues to go unchecked in a lot of ways. Strong ties to Epstein. And so I don't blame the people who are feeling like this whiplash with Cesar Chavez as a Latino and then holding that up to what we're seeing from our president, who's an old white man, or the many examples of white men who have been perpetrators of racist and sexual exploitative things throughout history, who are still on monuments, who are still named. And so I just want to hold the complexity of all of this. It's, again, not to say that any of the changes that are happening, I think they should be happening, but I think more should be changing. And that's what I'm sitting with today. And those are some of the things that I hadn't named in the past episodes that I wanted to share right now. I'm curious just to hear what you're sitting with all of this and how you're doing. And if you want to hear more of the Resourced and Resourceful Leadership podcast, please follow or subscribe to the show wherever you like to listen to or watch your podcasts. To support the show, please leave a 5-star review and share it with a few people who you think would appreciate the show. And please check out the link to SpeakPipe in the show notes. I'd love it if you left me a message about what stood out to you from the show or topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes. You can, of course, text me if you have my number, or send me an email. There's ways to connect with me in the show notes. Thanks again, and take good care. Just kidding. This episode gets a PS as well. I forgot to mention that one of the things a friend and I talked about with this whole discussion about moving beyond the single leader is what Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen Buddhist leader, said. He once predicted that the next Buddha will be a Sangha. And Sangha is a community, the community of people who are practicing mindfulness and practicing loving kindness. So I love that too, in his example of not anointing the next leader when he passed, but also articulating that beyond one person, community, that's what will support us. So I just wanted to leave on that note to think about whether it's the breadth of movements or the Sangha, the community of mindfulness and loving kindness of practice. What might that look like as we recalibrate our notions of leadership? All right, now take care for real. Bye.